Welcome back, everybody. Once again, my name is Aaron Smith, and I am the head of information security consulting here at Smarttech247. And today, it is my absolute joy to bring with me Darren Leach. Darren, go ahead and introduce yourself.
Hi, good afternoon, Aaron. Thanks for the introduction. Yes, my name is Darren Leach. I'm the sales manager here at SecurEnvoy. We're a cybersecurity vendor partner of Smarttech, and we focus on helping organizations around their identity challenges. We've been a vendor for over 20 years, so we've got good background experience of helping all types of organizations around their identity and security challenges.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Darren. So today we are talking about one of the core concepts at the center of everything that is our upcoming ZeroDayCon, right? We're talking about identity. And it's one of those things that I think has evolved, not rapidly, almost sort of inescapably, right, over the last 10 years. And the last 10, 15 years or so, we have moved from identity protections and controls being sort of a forward-leaning technology to these days being the absolute standard, right? They are the center of a lot of forms of defense. And for a really long time, since sort of, I think, the advent of cloud and the push of work from home, the sort of classic network perimeter has long since disappeared, right? And I think that's one of those things that we've talked about on many, many occasions. With that being the case, identity has really jumped forward even further to being the sort of very first line of defense when it comes to securing an organization. How does MFA really fit into that conversation around identity as a whole?
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think obviously our MFA solutions have been around for over 20, 25 years. And I think obviously we've seen a massive shift and a change in MFA and identity requirements over the last few years. I think what we've seen is originally organizations would have an MFA strategy really just to protect those core remote service applications, whether it's VPN, Citrix, maybe email systems, and remote services. And that was primarily the core requirement. I think in addition to that, it was always a specific set of users, whether it was management or remote workers. So back then it was really a certain set of users for certain critical applications. And that was a requirement from an MFA perspective. I think now as we look at identity, it's a broader, more of a business requirement for organizations. And what we see now is there's a whole range of business and security challenges which are changing how organizations manage their identity strategy. So there's a couple of key things there. Number one is, we've touched on it there, that from an application perspective, it's not just those traditional remote services now like VPN and Citrix, it's any critical application within the environment. And that it could still be VPN and Citrix, but also things like those cloud services, whether it's those online cloud CRM tools, whether it's CRM or business portals. It could be those internal systems, whether it's web services or remote desktops, workstations, or even protecting admin accounts. So I think one of the key changes there obviously is protecting more applications. I think also now with most organizations enabling things like hybrid working, where most users are either in or out of the office. I think identity is a strategy for all users. It's not just those management or remote workers that it was years ago accessing a certain application. I think every user now within the organization is considered as part of that identity strategy, because you've got to protect everyone in whole. So there's a combination of factors there. One is obviously the applications, two is the users, and obviously with the shift to cloud with a lot of organization, that introduces more challenges as well. So, but identity obviously is a key requirement, and MFA and the broader identity requirements there, Aaron. So I think that's what we're seeing as organizations change their requirements. They look at that broader user environment that they've got and how to deliver identity as a strategy for all their applications and all their users.
That is a great answer. Thank you. It's sort of interesting because for a really long time, it was just a handful of employees, right? It was a handful of sort of privileged employees, privileged applications. And it's funny to watch, right? Because that technology has shifted down to the entire workforce body. And then those privileged users, of course, moved on to PAM, right? They moved on to much harder, much more secure forms of identity protection, which is really fascinating to watch. This sort of, I don't want to refer to it as creep or bleed because that sounds sort of negative, but this sort of growth of identity protection across the entire enterprise just it reflects very strongly how clear it is that identity sits at the very center of everything that we're doing. Um, you mentioned some interesting complexity and sort of how it's being delivered to different applications. One of the things that I think is really fascinating is what is logging in these days has changed quite a bit, or where it's touching MFA has changed quite a bit, right? There was this space where for a really long time, MFA was about employees logging into things, right? But the truth is, it's become way more complex these days. Right now, we've got service accounts, we've got partners, we've got contractors, we've got applications, and these days you've got agentic AIs, right? All wanting to log in the same sort of way with the same kind of protections. How do you think that organizations these days are sort of getting control across that much more complex environment of sort of folks that are logging in?
Yeah. Yeah. I think when you look at the user base, I think as we touched on earlier, I think that there's a couple of key things. Obviously, it's more users now. It's not just those admin users now. It's the whole workforce, whether inside the network or remote. But it's also that partner supply chain, which is a key requirement of people coming in. So they may not be a part of their IT environment. They may be external to that environment. So it's internal corporate users. It may be external users accessing their system. Also, online users. A lot of organizations have some kind of online presence. So it could be customers or consumers. So it's controlling or giving secure access, whether it's those internal systems or third party systems or online systems, to those types of users. So I think from a user perspective, it's a lot more varied now. And as you say, those admin or privileged users, they're even more secure and they're highly targeted when it comes to the attackers. So they have to be even more secure. So it's covering the whole user workforce. I guess the challenge a lot for organizations is how to deliver that not only securely but easy for the user experience as well, because what they don't want to do is deliver a security strategy and the users not to want or be able to use it. So it's delivering a secure but flexible approach to the users, because not all users can use an app. They're not comfortable to use an app, or they may be going into secure data centers where you can't take a phone. So it's looking at that strategy that supports their corporate users, those partner supply chain, and also corporate users. So it's having a secure, flexible strategy, I would say, there of delivering some kind of identity or MFA technology for those users as well.
Thank you. So I think it's really fascinating for me because I think there's a ton of I think in a lot of ways, a lot of organizations think identity and identity protection was something that's been solved, right? You hear this a lot, right? There's a lot of organizations like, well, we don't have X, Y, or Z, but we've got, our IAM system and it's fairly robust and so on and so forth. A lot of people feel like it's solved. And yet, let's look at some of the biggest hacks in the most recent years, right? Like Marks and Spencer's a really great example of an identity hack. And most recently, Striker, right?
Yeah.
This is straight login, right? They had credentials. It was one of those places where I think it's interesting to note that as much as people feel like that's being taken care of, it's one of those things that is creeping up and becoming more and more noticeable when it isn't, or when it isn't robust enough, right? When it isn't a strategy and it's just a check box. It's one of those things that it's very clear now that the vast majority of attackers outside of complex nation state or well-developed ones like say shiny hunters, right? Outside of those guys, and even within them, right? Shiny hunters is sort of famous for identity attacks, right? One of those things that's really fascinating to me is that they've almost given up on things like hacking through firewalls, right? Like that's done, right? Like they're so much more willing to go after the people. How has at the MFA industry and the organizations like yours that service MFA, how have you guys responded to that shift where everybody is now like, in all honesty, any legitimate attacker, it's very rare for them not to start with credentials, right? And start there and start from the already knowing.
Yeah, no, it's an interesting question. I think there's a couple of things there. First of all, we're talking to a lot of our existing customers who are being targeted at that credential level via the firewall, and in that way. So that we are seeing a lot. That's increasing all the time. So, and that's being an automated process. I think what they're trying to do is target an organization with the lowest security fence, I would say, to try and get in and go from there. So number one, that is increasing all the time, and we're talking organizations around that. I think the second thing is around those social engineering attacks. And I think, as you say, that seems to be the first point of any identity, or even a ransomware, a larger security breach. I think attackers are getting more intelligent and targeted on trying to profile and target individuals or senior management so they can get access to the system. I think there has been a number of breaches where that has been the method that's been used. I think they targeted a number of retail organizations that way. So I think from an organization perspective, I think what you've got to start considering is a number of things. It's not just having an MFA and yes/no authentication. It's starting to look at those more advanced identity features to try and reduce that risk, right? And I think and that's in addition to what we mentioned earlier about protecting more applications and having greater control, but it's about those security features and conditional access rules. So things like verification tools that should have helped the Marks and Spencer when you're verifying a user with a technology, not a process, but a technology. If a user's trying to change things, a username and password, that's one method. GeoIP or location tools is really becoming stronger for organizations now. I think especially as they look at breaches outside of Ireland or the UK or their local country, it's having better visibility of control of who's logging in and trying to build policies on if you're in a specific region, you can't log in. So that's another method now of really trying to lock that down. But there's other additional things like session management, for example. So for example, if Aaron's logging in at 9:01 from Dublin, then he's logging in at 9:02 from China, there's a problem there, right? There's multiple attacks. So I think that's the key consideration now, is in looking at those features, which is functionality, and those policies, those conditional access policies, to really enhance their interface strategy rather than just enabling for users. Is looking at those broader features across their environment and across their user files, and it's kind of going into that zero trust message of locking it down and then enabling users, because if you're not locking it down, the targeters will find a way in, or going via credential wave. You're not locking it down. So, and those features are available now for organizations to start locking down those authentication methods.
So that's really good. You brought up a couple of really interesting things there that I thought were really fascinating. First of all, you brought up sort of a combination of breadth and depth, right? Which I think is interesting. Breadth is, we're talking about sort of those applications are getting covered, more users are getting covered, and depth is sort of the sort of greater feature set being used. Let me ask, from your perspective and what you see from a day-to-day basis, when organizations think they're protected, what's the most common thing they're missing? What's the most common thing that you're seeing people skip?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think primarily it's obviously the application. Most organizations are just protecting one or two applications. They're not thinking about that broader strategy of protecting those other systems and other servers. They're only really using it for one application, and they're not looking at those additional features. And it may have been that it's been an integration that they've had for a number of years and they just haven't updated it, or maybe their existing technology doesn't have the capability to extend to all their users, all their applications. So it's having a commonly used cloud interface strategy, but not looking at their broader business strategy. And that's the challenge now, especially as we look at some of these more advanced attacks. Organizations have to step it up rather than just having a commonly used approach for MFA for one or two applications, and also looking at broader identity, whether it's with zero trust, conditional access policies, and those other features within an identity strategy, whether, as you mentioned, privileged access, password management, IGA. There's a range of tools available. It's just it's looking at that more enhanced strategy, because if they don't, they're going to be the easier one to target and less secure, and also compliance regulations as well. So it's about having that broader strategy and delivering that, but they may be restricted by their current solution that they're using, and that may be one of the challenges.
That's a really good point, and you just brought up something that leads me into one of my favorite topics, which annoys a lot of people. But here in Europe, compliance is an extraordinarily complex and a fast-moving requirement, right? It really is in a lot of ways. And I think while from the outside, we as consultants can look at it and very easily say, well, it takes years to do a particular piece of compliance work. The truth is, compared to everything else in business, compliance can move very quickly in Europe compared to other parts of the world. And it's a really interesting pressure that's been created on a lot of different organizations. So right now, everybody knows DORA and NIS2 are full force. DORA's out, NIS2 is on its way. It's in place in like, I think 4 different nations across Europe, and it's going to spread to all the others very quickly. It's putting a lot of pressure on access controls in general. From the MFA space, how is the tooling making that easier for organizations, right? They say they want to move into more MFA across their organization. How is the tooling making that easier for them? How is the tooling making that both sort of practical for them from an employee perspective and scalable from an organization perspective?
Yeah, no, I mean, compliance is certainly a hot topic now for organizations. I think when we look at those compliance regulations, I mean, historically there were regulations like things like the PCI stand, for example, which is more for those financial retail organizations, and then more recently, obviously, you're now talking about things like DORA, NIS2. There's other regulations out there, whether it's Cyber Essentials, cyber insurance. There's a whole range of them that are relevant across the EU, the UK, and Ireland, and across the European region. I think a lot of the discussions within those regulations are very similar, right? They're pretty much, when it comes to an MFA identity set, what they're really saying is, or to organizations, is that you've got to have a layered strategy now when it comes to MFA and identity. You've got to protect all key critical services. Anything that's got a login that's a critical services, you've got to have MFA, whether that's an internal service. There's definitely a focus around that, around cloud services now, seeing that because that's been an area that hasn't been overly protected, I would say, by a lot of organizations. And the supply chain, which especially you look at things like NIS2, for example, that talks about the supply chain and the critical infrastructure organizations as well. So, but I think from a high level, it's really telling an organization that it is a business requirement to make sure you are protecting it with MFA. And if you're not doing it, then you're at risk of not being compliant in that particular requirement, right? So it's really having that. And again, it's back to, does your current technology allow you to do that from an application and from a user perspective? Does your technology integrate with those third-party systems? Can you roll it out to your users? Do you have the right solution and licensing to do that? And that is a challenge for organizations on how you implement that. You may have to complement your existing technology or use a third-party solution to do that. Either or is an option, but it's extending the current reach of your MFA to cover all those different applications, and with the understanding of what those compliance regulations are, because they are certainly getting more stricter as we go into this year, especially around DORA and NIS2. They're going to get more stricter, especially if you're not covering yourself from an identity perspective.
Well, and the cost is getting higher, right? I think from a CISO perspective, I think it's really it's notable that the shift, particularly in NIS2, is toward holding leadership accountable, right? Yeah. And I think CISOs were already feeling sort of very personally accountable for what's happening within their organizations, and the shift to that becoming a legal reality has been inevitable and sort of rapidly moving, right? I think it's an interesting amount of pressure on the CISO these days. So I've got a question. You brought up a couple of different times employees who don't want to use an app. And I think this is a really interesting conversation because I think, again, you mentioned there are scenarios, plenty of scenarios within government or within PCI where bringing a phone or a device that runs an app into the environment isn't okay, or folks who simply aren't comfortable using an app in a particular way. So it's a really interesting limit. And I think my question is, how does the MFA and tooling allow that, right? Like, what's the scope there? What's the breadth of what's possible?
Yeah, and again, I think, again, a number of years ago, the most common method for authentication used to be things like SMS, which was quite easily accessible for most users, or hardware MFA tokens back then, which again were very flexible. the options for users is kind of gone full circle now, because obviously smartphone apps is still a commonly used method. Most users are comfortable using some kind of app on their phone, which is flexible. But there are some considerations and challenges. I think a lot of the compliance regulations is advising all the organizations, first of all, to move away from things like SMS due to security reasons. So, and there's still a lot of businesses have SMS for their authentication strategy. So they have to review that. I think the second thing would be, when it comes to the app process, sort of using an app as your authentication method, again, it's got some challenges, because users may not be comfortable, they may not have a company phone. So especially if you start to talk to organizations, maybe they've got hundreds of users or thousands of users, not every user is going to have a phone. So how do you deliver authentication to those users where they don't have a phone, or they don't want to use the phone, right? So that is the headache. I think in addition to that, I think we've seen the full circle on things like hardware tokens now. We are talking to a lot of organizations, because they have to deliver identity to all their users. The hardware token requirement is coming back into the market as well, whether that's traditional card-based time tokens or USB technologies. That's coming back into the market. So that gives organizations a flexible approach for users that don't want to use the phone. And it's also more secure than maybe using SMS authentication. The other method that's been talked a lot about is FIDO2 authentication, which is around encryption keys and really taking that next level of authentication. And that's when you start looking at some of these regulations. And I think that's where the market is going now, from more smartphone apps to FIDO-based authentication, especially for your management or critical users. So again, I think it's more that flexible approach. Some users may want to use FIDO. Some users, yes, use a smartphone app because it's secure, but it's for those users that have a company phone. But then you may have some users that don't have a company phone. So it's looking at flexible, it's approaches that support that flexible method for their users to deliver that. And if, we talk to organizations that users don't want to use that method, and they switch off the application, so they have to use it. So it's not a matter of going, you can drop down to password, because that will defeat their strategy, right? So it's a matter of making sure you're secure and a user has a secure way of logging in. And that is always a challenge, both from a technical perspective and a cost perspective as well.
So I've got one last question, because I think you brought up a really interesting point about the FIDO piece, which is sort of where MFA is going from, sort of the future of different forms of authentication. So let me ask you, where do you think the future is for MFA tooling from a breadth perspective? Where else do you think we're going to see it enabled? And where else do you think in the future we could see MFA being a part of tooling that we maybe haven't seen in the past?
Yeah, and it's going to be.
I hate to make people predict the future, but give it a shot. Yeah.
Yeah, and it's going to be, obviously cloud and consolidation. There's a lot of consolidation around cloud services. I think that's one area. I think online is still an area that is not overly protected. I think that's one area. We do have a number of clients, especially in that financial banking sector, where they have online protection. But I think, whether you talk to local government, healthcare, there's still a range of sectors that have some kind of online presence, and that is not being protected. Most organizations still use traditional username and password. So I think that is an area that is going to be enhanced from a security as we go forward in 2026, because it's still username and password. I would always be very nervous logging onto a retail application with a username and static password. I'd be thinking carefully before I use that, because I'd want to make sure that was protected. And also things like OT technology and other technologies, right? If an organization is in a transport or utility sector and they've got a secure environment, then it's those types of areas as well. So looking at those very online or bespoke systems and services that they're delivering and protecting that, and those cloud services. But any application with a username and password comes under scope for how can we secure it, and it's extending that from those traditional methods like VPN and Citrix, of course. All right, but I think online would probably be the number one for me, and how people deliver those online that online protection away from traditional static passwords. Yeah.
I really appreciate it. Thank you. I know I jumped on you with a new one there. I love to ask people things about sort of what they see is going on in the future. I think there's some interesting space there. I think there's a lot of places like online retailers, massive ones, even Amazon, right? Where MFA is just not nearly as pervasive as you would expect it to be for a place that processes that many credit cards, right? You would expect it to be way more common. So it's interesting to see, right? I think there's a lot of complexity behind that. And I think there's a space where I think we're going to see a lot of growth and change in the next few. Well, we are absolutely out of time now. So I want to thank you once again, Darren. That was phenomenal. And I really appreciate your insight. Identity is to me one of the most, I think, the most fascinating. And while it seems like a solved problem, I think it's one of the most interesting spaces in cybersecurity right now because it is becoming so complex. And I really appreciate your insight and your help today.
Yeah, it's good to talk again, Aaron. And we look forward to attending the ZeroDayCon event with Smarttech at the end of April. And organizations are coming along to that great event, and we're happy to have further discussions around identity and identity security.